And so on behalf of Braver Angels, on behalf of our community, from our community to yours, I'd like to welcome everybody in this room to another great episode of America's Public Forum. As you might have heard, I don't know the specific details. We'll figure this out later, but this is just registration-wise, quite possibly the biggest America's Public Forum event we've done in the year or so that this program has been around. And so just ahead of time, thank you all for coming. Thank you all for registering. And thank you all for being interested not only in the work of Braver Angels, but in the deeper implications of the work of Braver Angels and our friends in this depolarization space on great issues of deep importance that matter deeply to American life. It's been fun working with a great team, and it's been fun getting things set up. So yeah, well, with that, let's just do a quick thing. So America's Public Forum has been Braver Angels' premier events program to bridge the worlds of grassroots red-blue depolarization work with the world of thoughtful journalism and scholarship and activism, and to bring some of the most thoughtful and interesting and penetrating minds on the great issues of our age in contact with and in communication with the great work in terms of bringing Americans together and helping us to see the humanity in each other across our divides that Braver Angels and a lot of our fellow organizations have done. It's been a lot of fun doing it. I look forward to many more events, but in the meantime, I'm quite looking forward to this particular event on this particular hot button issue that I can think of no one better to lead a conversation on than my good friend, the Braver Angels National Ambassador, John Wood Jr. So with that, John, let me hand it off to you as the MC of the evening. Everybody, looking forward to learning things with you tonight.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Luke. I appreciate that, and I appreciate all of you for turning out for this conversation. I think it promises to be an occasion in which we can go a little bit deeper, perhaps, on a subject that is of intimate concern to all of us. And that is the question of race in America. That is the question of our racial relationships, the question of Black America, but the future of not just Black America, but all of American society as it relates to our ability to navigate the tensions that present themselves to us in the context of our racial conversation. And it couldn't be any more fraught at the moment, although I don't want to overstate it, because there's certainly amazing organizations and amazing individuals who are showing us ways to think more deeply about these issues and to act on our common ground, who are setting an example that may not always be widely covered or celebrated in national media, but that nevertheless are out there with stories to be told. And I'm happy, very happy to be joined by, in my opinion, two such individuals this evening, who I fully anticipate will deepen our understanding from different, perhaps, intellectual starting points of the challenges that confront us in the domains of race relations, civil liberties and related issues as well. And so with no further ado, I'd like to go ahead and introduce each of them briefly. We are joined today by Rakim Brooks. Rakim Brooks is a public interest appellate lawyer and a cross-divisional campaign strategist with the American Civil Liberties Union. He is the senior strategist for the ACLU's Systemic Equality Campaign. Mr. Brooks, Rakim, my good friend, it's great to have you here.
Good to be here with everyone. Thanks for showing up. It's 8 o'clock on the East Coast, so I don't know where everybody's calling in from, but I'm already tired.
There you go. Well, we'll hope to reinvigorate you a little bit before it's time to be off to bed. And great to have you here once again. We are also joined by Coleman Hughes, another friend of mine. And Coleman is a writer, featured in many prestigious publications, including as a columnist for Quillette magazine. He's a former fellow at the Manhattan Institute, the host of the popular podcast Conversations with Coleman. He is also, I will have folks know, a jazz musician and a rap artist whose work can be found online. Coleman Cruz Hughes, good to have you with us, brother. Oh, and you're muted, Coleman. Oh, you're muted, Coleman. Go ahead.
Yeah, how about now? Can you guys hear me?
That's good. We got you.
All right.
Okay.
I'm very grateful to be here to talk with you and Rakim. Not only is it 8 p.m. on the East Coast, it's also the hottest day of the year. There is a very real chance, according to the text alert I got today, that New York has a blackout. So hopefully that doesn't happen. But
Yeah, right. Well, have them wait until we're done with our program. It's good to have you here, Coleman. Okay, outstanding. And I'm getting some background noise, so if we can just have folks mute. Okay, thank you very much. All right, so let's kick off the conversation. First of all, before we jump right into the meat of it, I think I would be curious to have each of you begin just by telling us a little bit about yourselves vocationally and also how you enter into the subject of race and politics in general. There's some sort of broad framings for your attitudes in relation to the broad social conversation that we're having about race in America. Rakim, would you introduce yourself for the benefit of our audience and give us some insight in terms of how you generally view these questions?
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to. So I've been getting some feedback as well. Not sure where that's coming from, but there we go. So good to be with everyone. Rakim Brooks. I'm a senior campaign strategist with the ACLU. As John alluded to, I grew up in East Harlem in public housing, largely with my grandmother, and attended public schools for most of my life until college, where I went to Brown, and then was a Rhodes Scholar for 2 years before coming back to the United States. And initially beginning to write at an organization called Demos, a left-leaning think tank, on questions of class and race and poverty, mostly out of personal experiences, things that I had learned growing up. My grandmother made roughly $12,000 a year, and so I saw firsthand the struggles that she experienced. My mom was a working class single mother. Wasn't that my dad was in the picture, they just were separated. And so these questions come to me somewhat biographically. They've been issues that I've always been interested in. Once I left Demos, I went to the Treasury Department and worked on community development issues for some time. Community development financial institutions, if folks are familiar with them, are institutions who have an affirmative obligation to lend in low to moderate income areas. And so I learned a good deal there before going to Yale for my JD and MBA. I've always sort of known I would end up back in this work, and that just so happened that this year the ACLU established its systemic equality agenda, which focuses explicitly on issues of race and class in America, and is really attempting to take a sledgehammer to some of the things that we believe ail us as a society that prevent Black communities from succeeding at comparable rates to the rest of America. And I'm excited to be doing the work. It in many ways feels like a fulfillment of things I'm supposed to be doing. I've come full circle. And so that sort of contextualizes where I am. I can say some more, John, about some of my thoughts about race, but maybe I should let Coleman introduce himself and his approach, how he's come to these issues.
By all means, Coleman, go ahead.
yeah, so I grew up in a mixed race, mixed income town in New Jersey, a very nice suburban town. And to be honest, didn't think about race very much growing up. Effortlessly had friends of many different races and never really thought about race much except as maybe the punchline of innocent jokes and so forth. And, I remember, to give a sense of who I was as a kid on the issue of race, I remember one time some kids wanted to play a black versus white soccer game when I was like 10 years old or something. And it just struck me as instinctively wrong. And I remember me and one other girl, we stopped it because I, like a lot of people, like a lot of children, I always had the sense that race, the meaning of race is skin deep, and anyone who attributes more to it than that is making an error, and an error that can have serious consequences. When I graduated high school, I briefly went to Juilliard in the jazz program there, set on being a jazz musician before dropping out and going to Columbia and majoring in philosophy, where I graduated about a year ago. And it was at Columbia where I was, although I was briefly exposed in high school, to a very different approach to racial identity. one that, you know, goes by many names: woke, social justice, so forth, which really struck me as very different from the kind of colorblind anti-racism that I had grown up instinctively believing. And it was at that moment I became very interested in why, when I had, you know, arrived in a place of such opportunity and privilege, it was precisely in such a location that the concerns about racism were the loudest I'd ever experienced. And that's the context in which I became curious about sort of what is the psychology of this, and so that's when I started, you know, reading and writing voraciously about the topic, and that's sort of how I came to it. So I guess I'll leave it there for now, and we can go on to some other questions.
Okay, outstanding. And we will shortly circle back directly to this question of color blindness versus color consciousness or racial consciousness, because I think that that's going to be at the heart of plenty of what we want to navigate through in this conversation. So we'll come to that soon. Very much related to that subject, I want to start us off by having a conversation about the conversation over race in America. And you know, the three of us, Rakim and Coleman, we had a short conversation in advance of this program. I guess it was a few weeks ago, and we made mention of, you know, the larger dialogue over race in America. And interestingly, and sort of amazingly, in retrospect, I don't recall the phrase critical race theory having come up in our dialogue once. And I think that's just because we were talking about the issue with various points of depth, and, you know, we're used to catch-all phrases emerging in the political conversation. But this phrase has so quickly become the anchor for even what seems to be the mainstream conversation over race in America, that I do want to ask you each what significance it does or does not hold to you. I was briefly watching Glenn Lowry, who's well known to the three of us and will be well known to many folks watching this program, and a conversation with Mark Lamont Hill, in which he opined that most people who use the phrase critical race theory are not actually talking about critical race theory in any formal way. It's more of an allusion to sort of a shift in mood, a shift in attitude, a zeitgeist which demands that we be very much conscious of race as it operates in our systems and structures and policies, and as it has operated in history, an insistence on that racial sort of consciousness. I want to ask you each, starting with Rakim, the idea of critical race theory, how relevant is it to the conversation we're having about race in America? Really, is that a clarifying concept or a confusing concept for us? And what would you like to say about it?
Well, I hope that it's a clarifying concept to some extent, though I agree with Mark Lamont Hill that, in fact, it's managed to obscure more than it reveals, partially because it's gotten caught up, as academic ideas sometimes do, in a political maelstrom that served to confuse. So maybe we should start off with some ground rules about what critical race theory is,
Sure.
And then say how it's sort of been interpreted and read. And there are various forms of critical race theory. I was a Black Studies major at Brown, among other things. I studied political theory at Oxford. And so I have some familiarity with the different ways in which this could be used beyond going to law school. And I would say that fundamentally what critical race theory is after is trying to confront the idea that the United States, the project of democracy, started as a colonial settler society, just to say we had to displace, murder, and kill the indigenous people of the land in order to start America. There is then a second question, what we often refer to as America's original sin, which is the importation of coerced Black labor in order to help build the country. there are then several other instances, the colonization, occupation of Mexico in order to extend our country. And that all of these pieces are crucial parts of our history. And the question is, what is the significance of those parts of our history? There are other terms that are used in critical race theory, so the permanence of white supremacy. The idea there is it possible to extract oneself from your history? So if all of those things carry any freightedness and weight, what does it then mean for our present? And there are those who believe that every subsequent, there are those who believe that every subsequent step in American history has been colored by those early experiences. So after the end of slavery or emancipation, you subsequently move on to the Jim Crow era. You then move on to eras of mass incarceration, which require various remedies in the society. We have two reconstructions, as people have articulated it. The first reconstruction being in the 1860s, and the second reconstruction beginning in the 1950s and extending through the 1960s. And people like William Barber calling for a third reconstruction. So that's my understanding and how I would level set. Now, the problem seems to be that when these concepts are being taught, they cause severe emotional, in some people, cause some emotional harm, some instability in their conceptions of themselves and their conceptions of their country. I would say to that, I was trying to give an analogous example to someone. When I watched Eyes on the Prize when I was 11 years old, first learned about Emmett Till. It was similarly traumatic, but it was a factual part of our history. That this young man was killed when he went to Mississippi and that it helped to ignite the civil rights movement. But if you can imagine, as an 11-year-old watching this in 5th grade for the very first time, it prompted in me all sorts of resentments towards my country. Those things then had to be channeled, as education should always channel emotion, towards some sense of betterment and understanding about the world in which you live and towards proactive action. And I think, if anything, that's where we should be in the conversation about critical race theory, which is asking ourselves, what does it mean to be informed about these concepts and then to act on them, to treat them as significant in relation to all the history that we've been teaching forever? And then to take proactive steps in that direction. Instead, what we've decided to do is really try to, bury our heads in the sand about those realities and that particular way of teaching history. Some might argue there's overemphasis. I haven't been in those classrooms. I don't have any children, so I haven't been in a classroom for quite a long time. So I can't tell you exactly how it's being taught or whether or not I agree with the amount of emphasis being given. But these are essential episodes in our history. And one of my friends quipped, just recently, we decided that Juneteenth was a holiday, but of course then have no ability to talk about it through the critical perspective that would be necessary to understand how it came to be a holiday and what its significance might have been to Black communities, not just at the moment at which the slaves were notified in Texas that they were free, but the continuing history throughout the United States of continuing to celebrate that particular day as a day of emancipation alongside the 4th of July. What did that mean to Black Americans? And I think critical race theory gives you some insight into that.
Thank you, Rakim. So Coleman, I invite you to comment on the function of critical race theory, at least as a conversation piece and sort of anchoring the national dialogue right now. Getting back to this question of, is this emphasis on critical race theory confusing more than it is clarifying? But also feel free to comment somewhat, at least, on your understanding and feeling about the substance of critical race theory. Do you see it as meaningfully informing the national dialogue? And do you have an instinct as to whether that is constructive or destructive?
Okay, so, as a philosophy guy, I've read a lot of the original critical race theory writing by Kimberly Crenshaw and many others, and I always found it to be an intellectually interesting philosophy, one among many. I thought it was wrong, but I also thought it was, I think a lot of philosophies are wrong that are, worth thinking about. I definitely agree with many who have said that actually what critical race theory is, in the original academic sense of the idea, is not precisely what people are talking about when they attack or defend critical race theory, at least in the past few months in the national discourse. You know, I could go on for a long time about how I would summarize it as a philosophy, but you know, the shortest version I can give is, well, it requires a little bit of an analogy, but let me just give this brief analogy for what I understand the philosophy of critical race theory to be. When you're a kid, you learn the concept of an accent, of someone speaking with an accent. And often kids learn this by implicitly feeling that there's a quote unquote normal way to talk, and anyone who talks different is speaking with an accent, right? Whereas you don't speak with an accent. And at some point you grow up and you realize actually any way of speaking just is an accent. You have this sort of aha moment. And what critical race theory says is it's kind of this a similar kind of realization, and except instead of being about accents, it's about the value structure of society itself. It's like there is no such thing as a neutral view from nowhere, just like there's no such thing as speaking without an accent. And the value structure of American society itself is steeped in white supremacy and racism. And so all of the standards, whether they be laws, whether they be norms, you know, taking the SAT and the structure of standardized testing being one example. These things that may be facially neutral are in fact norms that cannot be separated from the history of white supremacy and the fact that this country is fundamentally tilted in favor of one group and against another. That's the basic insight of critical race theory, that neutral value structures certainly aren't what exist in America and perhaps aren't even possible in principle. Now, I think that's a very interesting claim philosophically. I don't think it's right, but that's really what I understood critical race theory to be as a kind of philosophy nerd. What people are talking about when they talk about CRT today in the national discourse is not that necessarily. But they're talking about a general mood that has sort of existed since the 60s, if not earlier, about the narrative of what America is. You know, is America an inherently racist country that will never outgrow its racism? Do we need race conscious laws and policies in order to rectify the effects of slavery and Jim Crow, and a kind of muscular racial identity among Black people? Or do we need, you know, a colorblind universalist approach to anti-racism, a class-based set of policies, and with an eye towards identifying as Americans before we do as members of a particular race? And I think critical race theory has become a, you know, I think Christopher Rufo has had a large role in labeling that kind of mood, which has existed for many decades, with this particular philosophy, which is related to that mood. Certainly, they're not unrelated at all. They're just not exactly the same thing. So that's what I would say on that front.
Indeed. And I think that delivers us directly to this question, which I think is deeply baked within the sort of critical construct within which we are speaking, and that has come to sort of animate the larger discussion here. This question of whether it is vital or, in fact, grossly damaging for us to think and operate in direct recognition of racial categories. Now, I'm going to summon a couple of quotes here to help us give some context to this. But I have a quote here from Ibram X. Kendi in How to Be an Anti-Racist, where he says, quote, "Singular race makers push for the end of categorizing and identifying by race. But the unfortunate truth is that their well-meaning post-racial strategy makes no sense in our racist world." That's Ibram Kendi. And now, from the other side of that spectrum, take some words from Thomas Chatterton Williams, who writes and pardon me, that quote from Ibram Kendi was from How to Be an Anti-Racist. This here is from Self-Portrait in Black and White from Thomas Chatterton Williams, where he writes, I will no longer enter into the all-American skin game that demands you select a box and define yourself by it. And he goes on to say that whether we are referring to, quote, vicious bigotry or well-meaning anti-racism, unquote, that the perpetuation of these racial categories is pernicious. And he further says, quote, I am not renouncing my Blackness and going on about my day. I am rejecting the legitimacy of the entire racial construct in which Blackness functions as one orienting pole. And again, that's Thomas Chatterton Williams' Self-Portrait in Black and White. So we have a couple of polls here, maybe to some degree, Rakim and Coleman, you guys sort of represent them, although I wouldn't want to just say that without any nuance here. I guess my question to start with is, do you two see, granted that there are these two poles, where we could consider ourselves to be highly race conscious or absolutely sort of colorblind and disregarding of racial categories, is there a balance to be sought between these two? Or do we really do need to strive towards an absolute realization of one of these attitudes or another? If there is a balance that needs to be struck here, what is the nature of this balance and why is it important to reach for it? And this time I'll start back with you, Coleman, and Rakim can respond after you're done. Go ahead.
Yeah, so I do think there is a balance to be struck, or the way I would put it more precisely is that there are areas of life in which, to me, it seems appropriate to have a race consciousness, a benign kind of race consciousness. Am I going to go up to a Jewish person and say, you have to stop identifying as Jewish insofar as their Judaism means they like, Passover is meaningful to them. They like to think about the ancestral story. The memory of the Holocaust means something to them. They celebrate Hanukkah and so forth. That seems to me a rather benign kind of group identity. Now, that kind of group identity, unfortunately, very quickly bleeds into areas where it becomes pernicious. It blinds you, blinds you to facts about the world that are unwelcome to the group. So, in the case of Judaism, obviously, to be a Jew that is, for instance, pro-Palestine can be a seriously deranging opinion to have insofar as that's a belief that may be punished within your in-group, regardless of whether it's rational or not. And just the fact that it could be punished can lead you to not be able to think straight about that issue. And with the case of race in America, black, white, Hispanic, Asian, it seems there's an analogous thing to me, which is like, if your Blackness consists in the particular kind of music you like, the way you talk, the way you dress, what you're talking to me is what you're talking about to me is just belonging to a certain subculture, right? And the history of slavery is meaningful to you, and you like to celebrate Juneteenth. These are all, this seems like totally benign to me until the group identity influences truly the way that you think about, say, the issue of unarmed Americans getting shot by the police, right? It's like, are you taking the default black opinion rather than reasoning through the issue from step one? Insofar as that's what your Blackness consists of, then I think it becomes seriously toxic. But insofar as it's a kind of benign group identity, I think that is totally unavoidable and not to be discouraged even, right?
Indeed. And so, Rakim, same question to you. Are we to strive to embrace one end or the other of the poles between, let's say, strict race consciousness and strict color blindness, or is there a balance to be struck in the middle? And if so, where would you put that and why would that be important?
Yeah, it's a very complicated question to me. I was trying to listen closely to what Coleman was saying about the idea of any identity being benign, and I think even Thomas Chatterton Williams' description of it doesn't square with me in that I don't know that he would ever renounce being a man while recognizing that that has serious structural forces in his life about how he conducts himself. He would rather have to recognize within himself that as a man, I presume certain things about the world and exist in the world in certain ways and am received by the world in certain ways. I totally agree with Coleman's point of view that for me, identity should be emancipatory. I always say that my Blackness is a bridge to other people. By identifying my own identities, I better understand.
Yeah, oh, yeah, oh, in the band.
I ask that we
Was not very bland. He had his eggs in a pan.
Hey, we're
Can I say he had his eggs and yet he was like, hey, no, you're not getting your eggs in a pan today.
Sorry about that, everyone. That was a Zoom bomber. That was the first Zoom bomber in any America's Public Forum event. They have left the room and they will not be allowed back in. Sincere apologies about that. John, Coleman, Rakim, back to you guys. Sorry about that.
Yeah, no worries. I figured out pretty quickly we were being Zoom bombed. I'll assume Coleman sent them. So the point I was making really is using identities as a bridge. Coleman's analysis to me is exactly right, that it can be the opposite. There's for sure any set of identities. It doesn't just pertain to race, gender, class. How we come into the world, we come in with blindnesses. And part of education, to back to our discussion about critical race theory, among other things that you learn in the world. I really appreciated General Milley's comments on the subject where he said, I read Marx. I mean, I've read conservative columnists like Coleman and Thomas Sowell my entire life because I'm interested in what people have to say. And I appreciate that Coleman reads critical race theory, though he doesn't agree with it, because he thinks that it's interesting and it informs my perspective and helps me to shape how I think about things. To me, identities operate in much the same way. We're born with them. They're sometimes imposed by our communities. And part of human liberation is for sure to acknowledge them and make your way through them. To cast them off, it strikes me that Thomas Chatterton Williams and others are engaged in a different kind of project, which is to say that the identities are insignificant. And that doesn't seem right to me. It doesn't seem to actually square with reality. I don't know if we'll get to this, John, but I'll just bring it up now and maybe it'll serve as a segue back to something we were going to discuss. But in preparing for this, I went back to an interview that I did with Michael Dawson, who is a University of Chicago professor who specializes in public opinion. And he was pointing out that the largest gulf in public opinion is between Black Americans, white Americans, controlling for all, class, ethnicity, gender, and so forth. And this is one of the quotes he gave to me then, which was, whether we're talking about what the role of government is, which you think of the United Nations, political leaders, Ronald Reagan, Jesse Jackson, Bill Clinton, President Obama, or how to respond to Hurricane Katrina, and whether it had anything to do with race. Across a wide variety of issues, we see differences between mainstream Black and white American opinion dwarfs anything in American public opinion, period. Democrat versus Republican, men versus women, conservative versus liberal. The white-Black divide is the biggest, one of the biggest in the world, and certainly the largest gap in the United States. Take, for example, the Hurricane Katrina point. 38% of white Americans thought Hurricane Katrina had some relationship to race. 90% of Black Americans thought that it was about race. To Coleman's point, to the extent identity is obscuring anything on either side, that is to say that enough white Americans aren't acknowledging that it had something to do with race, or enough Black Americans aren't acknowledging the other factors beyond race, one would have to understand their identity as Black, or as a man, or as a woman, or as any particular category, in order to then be able to confront how group identities might be constricting their ability to understand something, or, and this Coleman didn't say, and I'm curious if you would agree with it, or actually may enhance one's ability to see something that other groups are unable to see. That is to say that there can be, out of a certain kind of camaraderie and group consciousness, an elevated sense of what something, of an experience that in isolation you couldn't have. So for example, when we're discussing issues of police brutality, it may very well be the case, or maybe that's not the best example. Let's take a different one. Issues of infant mortality. It may very well be the case that Black women in isolation might understand themselves individually to be having a problem within their lives and in the healthcare system when they lose a child, they miscarry disproportionately. But by being in community with other Black women and then understanding actually there's something going on, many of us are experiencing this, they develop elevated consciousness. That is through a recognition of their identity and place. And so I think the kind of rhetorical back of the hand to identity ignores the actual structural forces that identity create in our world and the extent to which our ability to see the truth, it becomes refracted through identity, both for good and for ill.
Okay, pardon me. We're working back and forth with the mute function here as we seek to minimize musical interludes, in the course of this conversation. Coleman, I would be interested in hearing your response to Rakim's point about there potentially being a positive cognitive function that is served by, or positive, say, social epistemological function served by being a part of a group identity and having that reveal things in experience that may actually be hidden if one is sort of neutral or perhaps merely has kind of a benign relationship, an aesthetic relationship to ethnic identity. Do you see that as being a part of the picture potentially, that there's some positive social awareness to be gleaned through having such an identity?
In principle, it's possible. In practice, I think it happens far, far less often than groups getting together and in every possible way, in every possible tribe, exaggerating the grievances against them and minimizing harm that they cause. Right. This is true of really literally any tribe in human history. The tendency when one gets together in a tribe is to get together and say the other tribes suck and we're perfect. There's a center of gravity flowing towards that opinion that is so strong in our species that it just tends toward unreason on every side of an issue. Again, there are, I would acknowledge in principle it's possible and certainly has happened for people to get together in a group and realize, holy shit, the thing that happened to you also happened to me. This is actually a problem that has to be solved at the level of groups. And I think that kind of consciousness raising played a big role in, the lead up to the civil rights movement. You go back and look at what A. Philip Randolph had to argue in the 1940s. A lot of what he had to do was actually get Black people to realize that there's something worth fighting for here, to not just be jaded and resigned to their lot, and to say we can succeed. We don't have to live with this injustice, and it's happening to all of us, and to consciousness raise in that way. A lot of it, he had to do a level of persuading that wouldn't have been necessary nowadays and that we take for granted because of the moral ground that was gained by the civil rights movement. So I totally agree in principle that kind of consciousness raising is possible and happens. I just see much more often on almost any issue of significance you could name, people by race and by party getting together and saying, we're not to blame at all, and the other side is entirely to blame, and screw whatever the facts on the ground are. So that's what I would say.
Rakim, my guess is that you likely have some sentiments in response to that analysis, but if so, I wonder if you might not leverage them in addressing my next point here, or my next question for you both. So what I'd like to do is ground this dynamic of the conversation in some actual issues. And so I think that, and three of us all have a concern in relationship to issues of civil liberties and so forth. And obviously, Rakim, this is directly your field. Nevertheless, when we think about issues such as voting rights, for instance, I think that there is a way of looking at the debate over ballot access in America that, on the one hand, could evaluate, let's say, voter laws in Georgia and say, okay, well, they are advocating for policies in the Republican-controlled state legislature that may be limiting early voting or may prevent people from being able to distribute water in line or reducing voting availability on Sunday, and that these are misguided policies, maybe motivated by political ire, but something that we should look at in its own context. Or we could evaluate those policies and say that there's a direct connection between Georgia's political reforms here, a history of anti-Black discrimination in the South, the repealing of, or the nullifying of I think it was Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, the pre-clearance requirement that called upon Southern states to achieve federal clearance for proposed voting reforms. We could situate it in that historic narrative, and some folks would say that distorts our ability to see the issue clearly. Others would say that we precisely need that narrative and racial context in order to see the issue clearly. And I think you could say the same thing about law enforcement, relations between the Black community and law enforcement. One could say that incarceration, mass incarceration, the phenomenon of mass incarceration is a function of criminal justice laws that are flawed, not well thought through, but that could be understood as merely being reflections of bad policy and bad incentives. Or we could tie mass incarceration, we could tie the deaths of unarmed Black men at the hands of police officers in 2020 to a longer racially charged history of brutality from law enforcement towards African Americans, and episodes of our country's history going all the way back to slavery, where incarcerated labor was perhaps the goal in the law enforcement practices of various parts of the country. And so the question is whether I invite you to comment on either or both of these issues specifically, or if there's another example in the domain of policy that you might want to refer to, that's fine too. But can either of you speak to particular issues and show how color consciousness or color blindness either distorts or clarifies our ability to grasp the issue in clear-headed empirical terms? And so, Rakim, I'll go to you first on this, and then we'll circle back to Coleman. And can we unmute Rakim? I don't know if Rakim can unmute himself, given our.
Yeah, no, I was waiting for 2 minutes.
Okay, there you go. You're pretty clear, my friend. Okay.
So these are both good examples that I wanted to use, actually. In the law, there's a notion of disparate impact, and the basic idea being that a policy can disproportionately affect one group or another, usually a recognized group under federal law, and therefore it would be impermissible, regardless of the intentions of the policymaker. And so take voting rights and criminal justice in particular, and I wanted to give these two examples. After the 2020 elections, where we had record turnout, including among Black communities, pardon me for the sounds in the background, we had record turnout among Black communities, states throughout the South, throughout the country, but largely concentrated in the South, Republican-led states began to enact various voter measures. Let's not characterize them in any particular way, which on the whole were excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm losing my train of thought because of the noise, but on the whole were thought to disadvantage the participation of Black people, perhaps by virtue of their class, which is to say, here's an example. We made Juneteenth a national holiday. We couldn't make Election Day a national holiday. Why would that disproportionately benefit Black Americans? Because Black Americans are disproportionately in working professions that wouldn't give them the same levels of flexibility on that day, right? So you can have various levels of construction of a voting system that either empowers Black people to vote, or let's say a group of people so congregated, or disempowers them. Now, we similarly, in the context of criminal justice, let's say that you are living in a Black community that is plagued by gun violence, and the police say, well, we know how to stop the gun violence. We're going to stop each and every one of you, Black men between a certain age, as a way of preventing the gun violence. And almost certainly that will prevent the gun violence, because if in fact 99 or 100% of the guns are located in that population and you're able to stop everyone, then you will end the gun violence. But you then get a response from the community which says, well, actually, because the police, meaning rightfully so, would be afraid of interacting with anyone who might have a weapon, they treat all of us extraordinarily badly in an attempt to deal with what is a very real problem. And so might we suggest something else? The reason I'm drawing out these two contrasts is because this sort of gets to my point about the Michael Dawson piece. Even if the policy is neutral, it seems as though the people who are instituting the policy are not responsive to the people who complain about the policy and say that it will disproportionately impact them. And the question is why? And that is when human beings begin to refer to history and other sets of assumptions about why it is they're engaging in this particular way. Now, take the case in North Carolina, you all may not remember it exactly, but Cooper v. Harris, where the Republicans essentially drew lines so that they were including more Black people in a district. They were packing Black people into a district. And of course, the response from the Republicans was, we don't care who they are. We just know that they're Democrats. And because they're Democrats, we're trying to pack them. It has nothing to do with race. But in the context of having the discussion, they had to say, how do we know these people are Democrats? Well, there's a large Black population here. Let's move them into district. This gets back to the point about racial recognition is happening all the time for ill or for benefit. And the extent to which the groups of people who have been racialized are then allowed to participate meaningfully in the process to redress and perhaps remake the policy strikes me as something of significance. And so this isn't so much of an answer to your question, John, as a framing device for our thinking about this, which is if in fact a disproportionately impacted group lacks the political power to reverse the decision that disproportionately impacts them in a given area, then how are we to analyze it? Are we to say it's merely race neutral, when in fact there's a bunch of Black people against seemingly a bunch of white people in many of these states? Or are we to say, even if it were race neutral, it has this disparate impact? Or do we layer on an analysis about history? And my point is, people are always going to lay on an analysis about history, and it is a relevant factor. That's just who we are as human beings. We don't come into this world without histories to which we are unattached. I tend to share much of Coleman's, I think, personal sentiment, where I'm often trying to cast off labels about what people think I should and shouldn't be doing in the world. But my political analysis doesn't reside there. My political analysis resides in the fact that people are trying to label me and are trying to make assumptions about who I am and what I will do and shape policies based on who I am and what they think I will do. So I hope that's helpful. I got interrupted a few times in trying to formulate that. If anything was unclear, I'm happy to restate it.
No, not a problem at all. And Coleman, and let's make sure that Coleman is unmuted or is able to unmute. Coleman, I think that you have sort of a choice of frames here. I set up this tension in one way. It's something of a binary, taking a given issue and saying, okay, we can look at it through this lens or the other lens. Rakim seems to be saying that there's a certain inevitability to having to view these issues through a historical and perhaps a color conscious lens if we're serious about it. So respond how you would like to the core choices here before us.
So again, this is an area where I agree in principle. History can be very relevant to an injustice going on today. So with voter suppression, or let me say this, it matters how tightly the current circumstance actually resembles the specific historical injustice in question. So with voter suppression, you have much more similarity than you do with some of the claims people make about the police, in my estimation. So if you're going to say, if you're going to make an argument, write an article saying, look at the voter suppression that's happening in Georgia. Okay, it's not exactly what happened in Jim Crow, but look at these similarities. There's a kind of through line even that's worth thinking about, and that explains part of what angers people so much about it, in addition to the mere fact that you're making it a bit harder to get to the polls. It's like it has this historical resonance, and it's not too dissimilar. It's a softer form of what people did in the past, something that we all recognize as a stain on the country's history. Okay, that's a specific example where the argument from history contributes something meaningful and important. I see a lot of examples where it doesn't. So for instance, one thing people will often point out is that the police in America started as slave patrols, and that's supposed to be relevant to the problems that we face with policing today. That's a situation where I think, are you kidding me? Really? Are we going to are we going to impugn an institution for being old enough to have started in an era where almost anything was messed up? Someone like Candace Owens, for instance, will make the point about Planned Parenthood, that one of its founders was a bit too eugenicist for comfort, and will use that to score points against Planned Parenthood. And I think the same thing. What a cheap argument. What an actually an argument that doesn't acknowledge how any institution changes significantly over time, right? And I feel the same thing with the police, for instance. If you're going to look at a specific example where a cop fired on an unarmed American, for instance, and say, well, to understand this moment, we really have to go all the way back to slave patrols. There's a meaningful similarity here, or lynching, for instance. I think that's a case where the reflex to go to history seriously blinds you to how different the present is, and how the challenges we face are often truly new, right? Like every generation sometimes just faces straight up new challenges about which history does not necessarily give you a clear guide. So the long and short of it is, you have to take it on a case by case basis, right? And if in one case history is important, it doesn't imply that the reflex to talk about history is always useful, and in not some cases harmful.
Rakim, I would like you to respond to that. Is it the case that arguing from history and having a historical and a cultural consciousness through which we evaluate issues of policy is perhaps situationally beneficial, but not necessarily universally so, or so in principle? Or would you push back on that? And I see Rakim's mute. Okay, there we go.
Oh, I got the power to unmute myself.
You've taken your power back, brother. Go for it.
Thanks, Luke. I think, now I sort of sound like Coleman. I think in principle, I agree. Of course, that seems right to me, that you can't use history as a kind of blunt instrument. Because something existed in one way, you just sort of, let's put it this way, you don't use history to sort of flatten the present into something that you can understand. I think that's right. The example of the police officers starting as slave patrols struck me as the kind of thing that someone references to tell a longer story, not just to tell that story. And I think one of the things that I'm sort of hearing in Coleman, and I'm curious if he thinks this is accurately reflected, is there can be, again, instances in which race and racial analysis, sociological analysis is just used as a blunt instrument, and people are using it to justify ends that they want to affirm within themselves. And maybe it's my own predilection, I try to ignore those things as far as the sophistication of whether or not something can or can't be used. The people who I've read who try to start by saying that these began as slave patrols, then try to trace a history that actually is not that long as you might imagine, right? My grandmother was born in 1933. Her grandmother, if I got this right, I'm pretty sure her grandmother was born a slave. She actually, therefore, has enough historical knowledge between the two links to link a very, very long history and categorize how things might have been over time and how they changed. So I think I'm pushing back on Coleman to some extent because, yeah, if someone just says there were slave patrols, so you can understand exactly what the LAPD is doing today, I would say, like, they have different weapons, they have different patrol patterns, they have different instincts about the threat that Black people pose, they have different, frankly, measures to enforce violence against Black people than they did, and vice versa. So those things would be complicated. But if someone started me there and says, look, I'm trying to help you understand why we think of the police as a racist institution. And I want you to understand that the particular formation that we created police departments out of started this way. As I move you forward, I want you to understand that the people who began to occupy police departments were often ethnic, in the Northeast at least, something I'm more familiar with, were often ethnic immigrants whose first words and ways of becoming American were learning to say nigger and differentiate themselves from Black populations. And that those people then begin to imbibe the exact same racist bile that existed before they ended up here. And then it carries on in certain ways. They tell a very, very long story. Now, at various points, Coleman may say, like, that's BS, that's BS, that's BS, right? Like the various linkages that someone is trying to draw. But it doesn't strike me that historical analysis of the kind that I'm describing, which is trying to be delicate, attentive to various changes over time, is somehow irrelevant to public policy discussions. In fact, it seems quite relevant to me. Now, what we then do with it, I agree with Coleman entirely that you have to be sophisticated and nimble in your analysis. Things are not the same, right? It is uncomfortable to me when we just sort of take the phrase Jim Crow and drag it into any particular context without understanding the historical nuances that allow Jim Crow to exist. But I understand what people, again, this is the best among the analysts, not the worst among them, are doing when they say, but I need you to use this system so that you can begin to understand the ways in which it controlled Black movement. So that then you can start to look at this other system and ask yourself, is it doing something similar? And you might say it is doing something similar, but not exactly the same, so forth and so on. It strikes me that all knowledge that works that way. Scientific knowledge works that way. And we have to make corrections over time and say something you're relying on in the past no longer applies in the present because we have new information. But I tend to be someone who thinks history matters quite a lot, particularly the history where there are people with lived experiences still binding us to the past.
Indeed. I have a query that I want to launch, pivoting from this point, but I'm also fascinated to sort of observe each of your analytical streams seeming to converge a little bit. So before I go on to the next topic, Coleman, is there anything that you would like to say in response to Rakim's nuancing of the function of historical and cultural reference in analysis? As he put forward a sound analytical approach to utilizing these historical references, or is it still a problematic instinct in your view to tend to do so, at least in certain cases?
Yeah, so I'm going to say the same thing. I don't disagree with anything you said in principle. Seems to be a theme of the conversation. It's really, if we do have an agreement, it's definitely over the extent to which the problematic kind of historical linkage or historical thinking is actually occurring. I mean, I'll give one example of why I think it's more prominent or more pervasive than you might think. The 1619 Project to me is an example where an actually truly kind of cheap version of the historical argument was elevated to Pulitzer Prize, pump it through the school systems a level of prestige. And it's not to say everyone who wrote in that or really anyone who wrote in that project was a hack. I mean, these are serious people that when they write at length have serious things to say. Someone like Matthew Desmond, serious sociologist who I would not it would be unfair to characterize him by what I'm, the one example I'm about to give of his writing. But, one of his essays for the 1619 Project, he talks about how Excel spreadsheets are part of the legacy of slavery because people accounted for the profits and losses of the plantations using a similar structure of like cells. And like, so like I read something like this and I'm like, come on, like that's laughable. And it's fine for people have all kinds of laughable opinions in the world. There's people have many laughable opinions with the opposite political valence. They just don't really get Pulitzer prizes. So this turn I've seen really just, in the past 5 years or so towards a kind of lack of skepticism of these historical arguments, especially in elite media, is kind of what motivates my opinion on this.
Indeed. Last pass on this question, Rakim, because I saw you smiling a little bit at the spreadsheet example, but do you ever detect a little bit of excess, perhaps, in this mode of analysis in some of our elite publications or whatnot? And is there anything that you want to say to Coleman's summary analysis of his feelings here?
Yeah, that I think he's mostly got it right, and I understand the concern more clearly, which is, and Coleman, nod if this is correct to some extent, but there's a kind of race. It sounds like your view is like there's a kind of race machine, race hysteria, right? That populates a kind of public education, and it could be more sophisticated, it could be more thoughtful, but it's not. Right? What we've got people listening to, thinking about with regard to race, is just sort of crazy. And it ends up being, even if there was a more sophisticated version, I thought Coleman did a fabulous job laying out what critical race theory talks about. Once we get it down to the classroom, we've worked it through the major periodicals of the country, gone through different circles and reading groups and whatnot, suddenly, and knitting sessions, suddenly we get this version of it that's just like, if that's what people believe, we're in serious trouble. Like they've lost everything that might have been ascribed to the larger project. If that's the analysis that we're working with, I can see great merit in that. That complicated things, when the game of telephone ultimately leaves us in somewhere that is miraculously disorienting, factually incorrect, etc. And I think I would be more interested in trying to figure out why that's the case. And I think we might have different instincts about that. I tend to, I was having a discussion, one of John put together another discussion at Coleman that you weren't a part of, where one of the participants was talking about wokeness. And I was like, it's so funny to me because when I think about wokeness in a Black context, remembering again that 90% of, at least in some circumstances, Black people think different things than white people when they're polled in large numbers. When I think about wokeness, it never seems to mean what my white colleagues mean about wokeness, whether or not it be liberal white colleagues or like conservative white colleagues. And where the ire is cast is often at the white woke person, when I was like, I thought we created the term as a way of talking about self-education and knowledge and being able to understand the society in which you live and beginning to educate yourself about that. Again, a bridge towards something, not a way of closing down, or I like the sort of term muscular raciality, but kind of not to turn it inward and say, actually, this is a reason for us to never talk about things or to be critical of ourselves or other people. That phenomenon that exists in the society, that kind of race machine, race madness, race hysteria, is endemic to America. And that's why I'm always confused when people say we should stop talking about race. And I think, well, yeah, we could stop talking about race, and you would think that might stop the hysteria. But actually, if the source of the hysteria is about more than race, it's about power, it's about relationships between individuals, then something else will come up. And it will be based on race in one way or another, but we would be talking about different things. So I don't know if that's wholly responsive, but I get what agitates Coleman, what perhaps it forces him to write so much, that there's just all sorts of things that are said out there that don't really make all that much sense. But I think that about so many different topics that don't have anything to do with race. I'll give one last anecdote. I remember I was writing, when I first started, like Coleman, I was writing at a think tank, and I had actually learned a good bit about poverty. And one of my supervisors there said to me, watch how the news media will totally distort how to talk about poverty. I mean, I had like done the research, really read about it. And I can remember distinctly, they wrote a 2-piece article. The first article was the day before the poverty statistics were supposed to come out, and the next day were the poverty statistics. So, because they released them every September or so, if I can remember correctly. And I remember them releasing the first piece saying something like poverty would go down. I don't remember the exact context. And me saying that is impossible. It is impossible for all of these reasons. Like if you just look at the sociological data, there is no way that can be true. Before you even get to the supplemental poverty measure, the national poverty rate will not go down tomorrow. And I wrote a piece to that extent saying like, who are these people that you allow to publish on the front page of the New York Times? And then the next day it came out and the poverty rate had gone up because of course there was no way for that to happen. But to me, the questions about true knowledge being refracted through our media system and thereby distributed to people in ways that are false, misleading, incomplete is a wholly different problem than the race enterprise alone. It's happening at every level of knowledge.
Indeed. Okay. Well, I think that may, in a couple of ways, link into the next and perhaps final piece that I want to put on the table here, because I think we might actually pivot to questions a little bit early because there are, frankly, so many coming in. I feel the audience energy in the Zoom. So I'm going to want to turn over the show to the questioners in just a little bit here. But it occurs to me, it seems to me, and perhaps one or both of you will disagree with me here, but it seems to me like we are in a moment in American society wherein folks and on a range of issues, but certainly on issues related to race and identity, are either trying to argue each other or protest each other into silence. And so there's a way in which I think some polemical approaches to advocating for color blindness, you might say, tend to sort of delegitimize people as soon as they seek to make an identity sort of oriented point. And there's certainly, I think, a conspicuous way in which protests, what people call cancel culture and so forth, but the zeal with which we will sort of demand sometimes, whether it's through Twitter mobs or, revolutions in editorial boards, potentially, or what have you, the zeal with which we demand that people sort of absent themselves from a certain platform or communication space, even before they've had an opportunity to contextualize or clarify their comments, simply because it falls outside of an overturned window, presupposes this idea that we can, in one way or the other, force people out of their natural sorts of starting points for relating to issues related to race. But the truth is that I think you have people with different cultural and psychological experiences. You have some people who start from a vantage point where their identity is very significant to them and helps shape how they see the world. And then you've got folks who, I think we all have identity, but for whom there may not be quite as conspicuous a rootedness in a particular ethnic or subcultural identity, who have something that approximates more of a traditional kind of liberal way of looking at things. My question for you guys is on the sort of pragmatic approach to communicating across these divides so as to move society forward. Because I imagine that while it's worth defending one approach or the other, we're in a moment now where it seems as if PTAs all the way up to governing bodies potentially, and certainly the cultures within major American corporations and institutions, have difficulty functioning because we are so quick to delegitimize one another's starting points that we fail to do what I think you two have done masterfully here this evening, which is to sort of acknowledge the validity of where each the other is starting, and to sort of reason towards a place of understanding where we align on the level of principles, even if the specifics of our kind of analysis on things may vary. Do you guys have advice for us, braver angels in this audience, and for all who are watching, in terms of how we can most constructively sort of communicate across this, to put it simply, philosophical divide. Is it the case that if we do not neatly converge in the middle of these two poles, we cannot make progress at all? Or is it possible for us to learn from one another, even if some folks are seeing things through a more individualistically centered frame and other folks are seeing things through a more sort of group identity oriented frame? And I know that that's saying a lot, but I feel utterly confident in tossing that ball to Coleman. Coleman, what would you say to that? Looks like Coleman is muted again. Okay, there we go.
Can I unmute? Okay. Yeah, I guess. So this is the answer to this question has a lot to do with temperament and personality. I think some people are naturally better sort of listeners and conversationalists than others. Everyone has to start wherever they are, but wherever you're starting, it's pretty much never a bad idea to push yourself more in the direction of really listening to whoever you're talking to. And at the beginning of a conversation, let go of the desire or expectation to win it, which is very difficult to do, which I struggle with. Again, some people are just naturally much better at this, and some people are naturally terrible at this. And you should be really honest with yourself about where you are. But, good conversations happen when you go into it really seriously comfortable with the idea that you might lose an argument, and that's okay. Right? It's like you're not stupid if you lose an argument. It's not about winning. And if you go into it with that attitude, then you can actually hear what another person is saying and search your mind for what your honest response is, and see what it is. And then those conversation between two people that are working on that skill almost never goes poorly. So I would say spend less time being mad at others for not talking the right way or listening enough, and seriously worry about whether you are listening enough and actually, are you rehashing a debate you heard on a podcast or on cable news, or are you actually in the room with the person you're talking to, right? And if you're not in that second situation, try hard to get into it.
Indeed, and well said. Rakim, same question for you.
Yeah, I totally agree with Coleman, and maybe we just add two addendums or refining points. I try to be a student of organizational behavior. It's just something that interests me, and over again, one of the qualities in the best leaders is that they ask more questions and speak less frequently among groups. And so one actual practical tool is, in the midst of a complicated and fraught debate, you might just stop yourself and ask questions. To Coleman's point, the only way to really do that is to acknowledge that not to speak as much or more will not result in your losing the debate, but rather perhaps clarifying and understanding certain pieces. The second piece, I guess I'd offer, is a kind of humility where I think most human beings on some subject have something of value to offer, right? I know that's a very generic statement, right? It's like, it will rain somewhere today, right? Okay, not very helpful. But the point really is that I engage with people thinking that they have something of value to teach me, even if it is that to Coleman's kind of point, right, that a misperception is widely held. That's useful for me to know, because it again structures our social reality and things that I care about. The last piece I'd offer, which is in the spirit of this conversation, is being willing to entertain ideas that are not ones that you hold for whatever reason. Again, I thought General Milley's comment was extraordinary, to say I've read communist tracts and I've read Mao. I don't know if he said he'd read Mein Kampf, but I try to read everything, recognizing that some books you're going to pick up and you're not reading them because what's in the book is accurate. You're reading it because it somehow became a phenomenon and shaped, again, how people perceive the world. But I'm also engaged in conversation to learn and to grow and to have myself challenged and change. I think, based on what I've heard from Coleman, I share the kind of what we used to call an enlightenment instinct towards rationality and growth. That matters still to me. I think it should matter to all of us. And the only way to achieve that is again, sort of citing Coleman, is not to sort of fall into a kind of groupthink and only surround yourself with people who share your ideas, but to be in genuine conversation with folks who hold different opinions. Sometimes that's easier when it's a topic with which you are less familiar, a topic with which you have not developed hard and sort of deeply held views, but is adjacent to something that you care a lot about. I'm sure Coleman could school me all day and night about jazz, and I would learn quite a lot, right? And then we start to talk about race, Stanley Crouch, and other people who start to bridge that divide for us in topics in which we are mutually interested. That to me is one of the, again, a sort of helpful tool to engage in conversation. Sometimes you got to move away from the eye of the fire and just say, actually, this other thing is kind of adjacent to it and kind of interesting. Let's chat about that for a little while. When we get again into the difficult moments, ask questions.
Well, I look forward to having you both back for an event on jazz sometime in the future here. So, ladies and gentlemen, Rakim Brooks and Coleman Hughes, let's go ahead and give a round of applause / jazz hands, if you will, for our incredible speakers and thinkers here today. I really do appreciate it and love the closing sentiments here. I think that we are all very much aligned on those values and principles. But now, let's go ahead and turn it over to you folks, because I get the sense that there are questions bubbling up. And as a matter of fact, I can see the hands already. So before we start taking the questions, we have about, I think a little less than about closer to 35 minutes or so. So we can get a good chunk of time in, but I'm going to insist that people do their utmost to be concise and ask a question. Lengthy opening monologues followed by an excuse for a question mark at the end will very likely be cut off in midstream. I'm sorry, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but we just have to do the best we can to get everybody in the conversation, because I think there's a lot that seeks to be asked here. And for our speakers, Coleman, Rakim, obviously you guys can range out in response to the questions, but I'd ask you guys to be mindful of time as you do so. So let us begin with Rita Chisholm. Hello, Rita. Go ahead and ask your question. And Rita, go ahead and unmute yourself, or let's make sure she's unmuted.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I'm just going to read what I wrote down. Can we acknowledge that part of this struggle is that there are people of great education and intelligence who are driving, and I hate to use the word narrative because I don't like that word really when it's used in the negative context, but a narrative that the majority of those that they have inflamed do not really understand what they are being, the fullness of what they're being led to believe. And how much does psychology work into leading people to believe certain theories and things? Thank you.
Okay. Rakim or Coleman, either of you can respond to that.
I'm sort of struggling to understand the question.
Rita, could you
maybe restate it?
I can give it, Rita,
Go ahead.
we'll do the same thing I did with Coleman. Not if I'm basically getting the question, and you tell me. If not, we'll come back to you on it. But I took what you were saying is sort of the analysis, Coleman, that I was trying to summarize your term, which is you have people who might be very, very smart, have great ideas of one kind or another, but they don't recognize how it's going to land, that it requires greater context and so forth in order for people to fully appreciate what it is they're saying. Is that basically, Rita? All right, having said that, Coleman, you give it a shot, but I thought I understood that.
I'm still a little bit, so like what's an example of an idea? Are you talking about like critical race theory, for instance, or?
Yeah, I think the same sort of thing. I'll give it a shot. Rita, and maybe that'll give Coleman a chance to respond to it. I think maybe the right answer to it is, the kind of almost now quaint idea that you're responsible for your words, that we expect leaders to be responsible for their words, and we don't necessarily have a well-refined practice of, actually, here's a great idea. There's a book called Skin in the Game. I forget, it's Nassim, I can't remember Nassim's last name.
Taleb,
right? Yeah, Nassim Taleb, yeah. So he has this idea about skin in the game. And his basic proposition is much what you're saying, Rita, which is we allow people to say and do all sorts of things, and we don't force them to bear any of the consequences for it. And so all of the negative externalities end up in the world. And so he goes back to Hammurabi's code, and he says, if a builder built a home and the home collapsed, they put the builder to death. That's a tight link between your actions and the repercussions in society and what happened. And he talks about how we have all of these folks who, for example, supported the Iraq War, who went in one administration, said that we absolutely had to go in there because there were weapons of mass destruction. There was no effective feedback loop. And so they came back in a subsequent administration, though they had been entirely wrong about the presuppositions for the war that they presented to the American public. I don't have a direct answer for you other than to say, I think that's a great book that analyzes the problem and tries to draw out how is it that we can create tighter links between people. He uses the analogy of saying, don't tell, when you ask your broker for advice about the stock market, don't tell me what to do, tell me what's in your portfolio, right? It's a tighter link to make sure that if a person is responsible and has to bear some of the blame for what they do, they are more likely to give better advice, to be more considered about how the advice will land, so forth and so on. And I think that's the best we can do in society. And I agree with you entirely that we don't do it well at all. Especially when it comes to Coleman, this is basically, Thomas Sowell's ideas about intellectuals in society, that people just get to broadcast these things and all of a sudden they have horrible impacts in the world. And suddenly they're just off to writing their next column, which is why I'm not a columnist. No shade, Coleman, but just saying.
Excellent. Okay, great. And for time's sake, we're going to move on to the next question. Rita, thank you very much. I do appreciate that. Let's go now to Jessica Roberts. And Jessica, if you can keep your question tight, we'll get you tight answer. So go ahead and unmute. So let's make sure Jessica is unmuted. Can we unmute Jessica, or Jessica, can you unmute yourself? Okay, there we go.
Hi, I'm sorry. It wasn't allowing me to unmute myself. Thank you so much for the opportunity to ask my question. So I really have a two-part question, so I hope it's clear. I was watching an interview from James Elliott, and she was saying that our fascination with the term race is detrimental to the fight for social justice. So I want to ask, it's a two-part question. One, do you believe in race as being a social construct? And two, if yes, how do you see us progressing or reconciling with the myth of race, but the very real social impact of race? Thank you.
I'm going to invite both of you to respond to that. I think that we can do that efficiently. Coleman, go ahead.
Yeah, short version is yes, I do think race is a social construct. Like many social constructs, it has real world consequences. But this is an area where I do tend to agree with Thomas Chatterton Williams, who John referenced earlier in the discussion, where if something is truly a social construct, we should more and more push towards recognizing that at least where it matters, politics and values, we should really push towards, we should always be anchored to the idea that race is essentially a social fiction. And just because it has real world consequences doesn't mean we have to validate and reify it further than it already is.
Okay, thank you very much. And Rakim, same to you.
Yeah, I broadly agree with that sentiment. And I think the sort of dividing line between Coleman and I is that I tend to think, I tend to be a little bit more deterministic, I guess, in thinking that it already is reifying the identity. And the question really is whether or not it serves a productive function or an unproductive function at a particular moment. And you have to be able to acknowledge both, right? The ways in which some people will use their Blackness, again, as ways of balkanizing, as ways of closing off, and other people will use their Blackness or their race or whatever identity is, again, as a way of building a bridge. This is kind of like one of those classic debates about whether or not you can sort of unencumber yourself of all of your identities and what would be left if you were able to do that. And my basic view is you really can't. Race feels like one that you can pick off, but then when you start to talk about gender and you start to think about intersectional dynamics, you sort of say like, how would you do it exactly? And what would it really mean for you to do it? In fact, the tendency for some Black people not to want to identify as Black is actually something that has a pretty long history, right? For those, I mean, some of my family members are light enough to pass. And so that identity is just another refraction of a racial understanding of the world, kind of that racecraft idea that other people have used.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Rakim. Let's go next to Louis Lee. Louis, go ahead and unmute yourself. And I should have said this before, but if you would like to address your question to one speaker or the other, feel free to do that. But in all cases, be as concise as you can. Louis, you are muted.
I didn't have a question. I don't know how my hand got raised.
Oh, okay. Well, in that case, we shall move on. But thank you for your candor. Okay, I suspect that Randy Lieberman has a question. Randy, go ahead and unmute yourself. He unmuted and was remuted.
Oh, okay, there we are. Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for this evening. I'll just read my question, which is further down the list. And this is to Mr. Brooks. Do you support the idea that we are in the period of the third Reconstruction? If you do, does part of that process include reparations? If it does, what might those reparations look like? And Mr. Hughes, I hope that you answer this, address it after Mr. Brooks.
Okay, well, we have to make good time here, but Rakim, go ahead and respond to that however you like. I imagine you've got more to say than we have time for, but by all means.
Well, so it's to some extent, I feel like I'm going to disappoint Randy, and I'm sorry for that. We don't know each other, but I still feel as though I should do my best. Are we in the period of a third Reconstruction? We don't know yet, I guess would be my first answer to that. We seem to have moved off of a very large social movement, allegedly the largest in our history. Certainly by numerical numbers, it was the largest, but I don't know about percentage of the population. And now moved into a Biden administration that seems to be very aggressive in its views of how the state should be used to support various social measures, including the child tax credit, which is something I agree with, and maybe student debt relief and other pieces that would advance racial equity. So I don't know if we're there where we are in that process. I think time will tell. The second question about reparations and whether or not they would be due, I support a commission to actively study reparations, a bipartisan commission. We've had various forms of this before, but that's not a reason not to do it again. I try to remind people there was a first March on Washington, or an attempt at a March on Washington that didn't quite go anywhere, and then there was a second one that was successful. Repeating things is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think we need to study it and think about what exactly we believe ourselves repairing for and how we might produce it. There's a book by William Darity, Sandy Darity, and his partner that just came out called From Here to Equality, I believe, that lays out a fairly compelling and comprehensive case of what we would need to consider. And so I would point you to him as a way of thinking about this subject. He's someone more learned than I am, frankly, and I haven't come to a solid conclusion.
Okay. Coleman, if you have something pressing you would like to add to this, I welcome you to do so. Otherwise, I'd move on to the next question.
Just in short, I don't think we're in a third Reconstruction. As I said before, I think people throw around historical analogies, and there would have to be something analogous to slavery. The second Reconstruction, you could say, came after Jim Crow, something analogous to slavery, in the sense of being an injustice. I don't see what landmark moment could mark the end of an injustice that would have a third Reconstruction to follow it. But again, I haven't heard someone make that case, but it seems really dubious to me on its face.
Okay. Next up, George Milton. George, go ahead and unmute yourself and try and make your question concise. We're glad that you're here. Mr. Middleton, can you unmute, or can we unmute George? We having trouble with the mute? Okay, go ahead, George.
There we go. Yes, my question is regarding the difference between critical race theory and race ideology. And is everyone clear on those differences? And if so, shouldn't the issue be addressing race ideology instead of addressing critical race theory?
Okay. Rakim or Coleman, do either of you have a response to that formulation?
Yeah, if by race ideology you mean ideological racism, white supremacy, black supremacy, is that what you mean by race ideology?
Is that correct, George? Is that the distinction you're drawing?
I think I think he's muted.
Okay, George,
Okay.
you're okay. George, let's unmute George. This is like this thing that happens when somebody tries to open a door and unlock it at the same time and winds up locking back. We're gonna give this. Let's get this right for George. Okay, George, you're unmuted. Please clarify. Oh, goodness gracious. Okay, George, you're still muted. Luke, don't press the button. George, go ahead, unmute yourself. We're going to give this another 5 to 10 seconds, but okay, don't touch anything, anybody. Okay, George, please clarify. Go.
Okay, great. I am operating under the understanding, the historical understanding, that race ideology is about hierarchy by skin color.
Okay.
And there are beliefs associated with white and beliefs associated with black, and that begins with racial identity. So that teaches the ideology of race even in 2021.
Okay, I think we got it for the sake of time. Coleman, I think that is what you were speaking to.
Okay. Yeah. Understood. Yeah, you are totally right. Critical race theory is a different thing than race ideology. Race ideology still exists. You know, the last poll I saw, a couple years old, from like 2016, the General Social Survey is one of the most trusted polls, found that something like 1 in 4 white Republicans and something like 12% of white Democrats said they would not want a family member marrying a black person. Well, that's not negligible. Those numbers are not small enough to wave away. So that's definitely not what we're talking about with critical race theory. It's not about hierarchy so much as it is about the structure of society itself being racist.
Okay, excellent. Let's keep going. David Metzler, unmute. Go ahead and ask your question. Let's give David a second to unmute himself before we unmute him. Go ahead, David. Okay, maybe David cannot unmute himself. Okay.
Okay.
Yes.
Am I on?
Yes, you are. Go ahead and ask your question.
So this could be for both, but let me shoot it to Coleman. What do you think about I feel like the concerns a lot of people have about critical race theory are, instead of letting people voluntarily do a group identify themselves as a bridge, like Rakim was so nicely saying, it seems like you see a lot of reports of people being forced to group identify and to lead with that identity and make that subsume individual traits and identities and attitudes. Do you think that is a significant problem today? And maybe you could associate it with CRT or not. And do you have a response to, is that problematic, and what could be done about it?
Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, I would I would separate it from CRT. CRT is the label that's now being, slapped on that, but that's been around for many years. I mean, I remember when I was in high school, I was sent off to a workshop where, I mean, essentially they were really trying to get everyone to identify much more with whichever victim identity they could plausibly have. And it was like, you know, there are these certain subcultural contexts, elite Ivy League schools, you know, very progressive high schools, private high schools, and increasingly certain public schools. And you know, this is one of those conversations where if it's not happening to you, you're going to think it's, what are these people talking about? But you got to remember, America is a huge country. It's like 10 countries in one. And there are places in the country where there's still a lot of anti-Black racism as like a central problem. And there are other places in the country where people are sending their kids to school, and the schools are so steeped in the D'Angelo style of anti-racism that they're making, you know, 7-year-old white kids view themselves as white as part of the curriculum, and making them feel kind of uncomfortable about their friendships with Black kids, as opposed to letting things happen sort of naturally. So I do worry about that. And I think it's definitely the wrong approach to raising the next generation as the kind of anti-racist we should want them to be.
Thank you very much, Coleman. Rakim has dropped off of my screen. Did he migrate to another one, or did the?
I'm here.
Okay, I was afraid that the blackout had hit, the power outage had hit Rakim, but okay, you're still with us. Next, I'd like to go to Caroline Blackwell. Caroline, if you would go ahead and unmute yourself, and please ask your question. You can address it to Coleman or Rakim or to either of them as you may choose.
Thank you so much. I'd like to first say that I went to an independent and private school. I have worked almost 30 years plus in that context, and I know of no educators, period, who have ever taught critical race theory in any of our elite private schools. Given that, question is, given the persistent racial inequities that exist in our society, I wonder who benefits, or I'd like both of you to speak to, who benefits by the supposed ideology of color blindness, and who would benefit from ignoring the racial realities that exist in our country.
Okay, so who benefits from color blindness? Coleman, I think that you're the individual who should probably respond to that first. Rakim, I invite you to follow on if you like.
Sure. Well, when I say color blindness with respect to public policy, I mean policy that's based on class, which I think is the best proxy we have for disadvantage in this country. Obviously, any policy that targets the poor is going to disproportionately target Black people. That's but yet there still is a huge difference between a policy that uses class as its metric for who needs help in this country and a policy that uses race for its metric, which is, in my view, a less accurate proxy for disadvantage. So who benefits from colorblind policy is that colorblind policy based on class more precisely targets the populations most in need. So that's what I would say.
Rakim, would you want to add to that, or shall we proceed?
Sure. There was a second part to Caroline's question. Does someone remember it? I'm sorry. I apologize, Caroline. I remember the first part, but not the second. Just want to make sure I answer it.
Caroline, would you like to clarify very quickly? Go ahead and unmute.
Who benefits and
who benefits by ignoring the racial realities and disparities if we adopted a, quote, colorblind philosophy?
Yeah, thank you for that. Apologies again for forgetting. It's getting late for me. I have wrestled with Coleman's analysis myself personally because I grew up in a poor neighborhood, and so feel very closely to my class identity, and then went to Brown University, where of course I confronted many Black students who did not share my class identity. I think the problem has been, take the California system, for example. The thought was that they would eliminate affirmative action, and that many people thought that they would be able to use class as a proxy for race. And that has not turned out to be the case. Again, I think that because I have this reflexive belief that most Black folks identify as Black folks. It's a very strong part of their identity. And so to erase it necessarily means that you will, and try to create other proxies to access it, necessarily means that you will miss large numbers of people, because it takes two to tango in social policy. And so I've become dubious of it as a solution, even though I was optimistic about it at one point in my life. But to Caroline's, I think, deeper question about who benefits, this gets back to my point about disparate impact. The status quo benefits, and therefore necessarily the people who are advantaged at this particular moment benefit in our sort of racial hierarchy. And Coleman, I think, I sort of have a left libertarian view and he has a right libertarian view. I think government did a lot of this, and therefore government has a responsibility to fix a lot of it. That doesn't mean I'm not skeptical about government. I have all sorts of reasons to be skeptical, but there is no force strong enough in society to counteract what government did. I very much understand the conservative point of view, which is government did this. Why would you want it to ever do more? In fact, if you think that it's a racist institution, how could it possibly ever serve your interests? I find that to be a compelling point that I don't have an answer for. I just know that my predilection leads in the other direction.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, let's move on. Jeffrey Woods, please unmute yourself, sir, and ask your question concisely as you can.
There we go. Thank you very much. I'd like Rakim and Coleman to answer this. Rakim, I'm very interested in the idea, I've never heard of this, as race as a bridge. Could you give me a specific example of what you mean by that? And Coleman, I'd like to hear your response as well.
Yeah, very happy to. So I gave one example of it, which was sort of intergroup, which was a group of Black women understanding one another's experiences being common to them as a racialized subgroup. But I also mean it in the sense that understanding, I was very moved by Elizabeth Wilkerson's book Caste, because when I traveled to India, I was fascinated by what was happening there and how different it was. And to Coleman's point about not misusing historical analogies, it wasn't anything that I could relate to, frankly, as an American. At least I didn't think so. Elizabeth Wilkerson, whether or not I don't necessarily agree with her analysis, so let me put that aside for a second. But it wasn't something I could relate to necessarily. But I had some reserves of historical experience because I was a Black American to say, this is something that you two are tackling. This is the hierarchy and the group arrangement that you're trying to make sense of. You're engaged in a similar kind of struggle. And my belief ultimately is that the promise of humanity is to have multiracial democracies, not non-racialized democracies, because we come with these histories. The first step maybe that's the goal, a non-racialized democracy, but there have to be steps along the way. And that has to be the first goal. And so the question is, how do I use my identity as a bridge to understand you better? So people have moved around on my screen, so I can't necessarily find you anymore. But the idea is basically, what can I tell you about myself and how I grew up and how I understand my racial identity and what it means to me and the promise that it means to me to learn more about you. So I often say, you sometimes, this is one of the fascinating things, and you'll ask Black people, as a test, I don't know that you should ask Black people this, but just follow me for a second. I have asked friends, what does your Blackness mean to you? And you will learn quite a lot about a person, because sometimes their Blackness is entirely associated with negativity. It's about their hair, it's about struggles they've had, racism that they've encountered, et cetera. And mine tends to be, Black people have been some of the greatest freedom fighters in human history, for a common identity, to recognize that we are not somehow not human, and therefore to be able to see when other people are being labeled in ways that render them not human, whether it be the LGBT community. Not always, obviously there's homophobia in the Black community like there is everywhere else, but the best of the tradition allows you to see in other people disadvantages and ways in which society is attempting to limit their possibilities. And that includes white people and everyone else. Right? Because you're white doesn't mean you don't experience any disadvantage in the world. And I'd like to say that some of my experiencing disadvantage allows me to see that you experience disadvantage as a white person, even if you don't know that you experience disadvantage as a white person, right? And to be able to have that conversation, to me, is what we are ultimately trying to do as a community of equals, as they used to say in the civil rights movement. We want to be drawn together by these things that people could use to divide us. We say, no, 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 we're not going to allow that to happen. I know who I am. I know how I was raised. I know what's important to me. And I want to know what's important to you. And I want to see how we're the same. We may be different. Not everything is about similarity, but bridges are often built based on the similarities.
Indeed. Thank you, Rakim. Coleman, is there anything you want to add to the subject of emancipatory identity? Or shall we proceed to the next question?
Let's go to the next question because there's so many.
Indeed. Okay, we'll do. Up next, Bill, Bonnie, go ahead and unmute yourselves. But even though there's two of you on the screen, I'm going to insist on one question. So pardon me for that. But go ahead and unmute. No? Okay. Are we having trouble? Okay.
I got it.
There we go.
So my question is about critical race theory seeming to me to be having the ability to learn our actual history. I grew up in the South, and what we got was the ladies of the Confederacy's version of what American history was. And I think about critical race theory as being the first step being just the actual nation being able to learn our actual history. It seems like the issue that you're talking about with color, race blindness or color blindness is another issue. And I'm wondering if my analysis is too simple or not.
Thank you very much, Bonnie. Coleman, would you distinguish between these two items, color blindness and the value thereof versus our need to actually tell the full truth about our history?
Yes, I would. I think critical race theory is very different from a full accounting and analysis of American history. You could have a historian that knows more than anyone in the world about slavery and Jim Crow who didn't subscribe to critical race theory at all. They are truly distinct. The practice of learning and teaching history from critical race theory, which is a set of beliefs about the value structure of society itself, right? You could teach the most intensive class on why Juneteenth matters. You could be a historian who goes into the archives and discovers a slave plantation that no one even knew existed and had been lost to history without believing any of the philosophical and epistemological claims that are a part of what's called critical race theory. Now, how it's being used today, how that term is being used today, does have something to do with how history is taught, but really, these are two different topics.
Okay, thank you very much, Coleman. Let's go next to Ronald and then to John Benning. And I'm going to start calling out the person in the on deck circle so they can have their finger over the mute button when we get to them, the unmute button. But Ronald, go ahead, ask your question.
Hey there, excuse the kind of zombie look. I'm parked in my car so I can get some reception. So yeah, so I have the notion that a couple of you guys referred to it earlier, that to have a group identity has some comforts and benefits, and it also the deficits of having to adhere to a certain kind of a party platform or certain point of view, and it seems like it's a natural inhibitor to individuality and critical thinking. And I wonder, what we kind of do with that dilemma when the ultimate reduction of identity to politics is going to end up with the individual. And I think that's the place where we can have the most progress. I wonder if there's any commentary on that, if that's clear at all.
Rakim or Coleman, either of you wish to respond?
I'll just give the analysis that, you call them the founding fathers. Let's just use that as the catch-all term really quickly, right? They tried to design a system that was nonpartisan, only to discover that we would fall into partisanship, right? So I think you design for if you could redo it, you design for the system that's going to be partisan. I think there is this longstanding presumption that there is a kind of arc towards individualism. That, you know, if we just keep striving for it, suddenly everyone will be an individual. And that's not how human beings exist in reality. So it is always for me a kind of wishful thinking about social arrangements. It's not to say that any one particular individual can assume a kind of life and identity onto their own. But if we're talking about race relations in the United States, I think we have to talk about relations among groups of people, even while we're identifying that there's great variety and differentiation among people within that racial group. So my racial identity has never closed my eyes to something about the world. I don't, now Coleman and I both went to elite universities. So I always say, the people who are trying to convince you that you need to think something because you're Black are bizarre. They just are, whether they're Black or white. It doesn't matter who these people are. But the people who say to you, actually, there's a lot you can learn from the Black experience in America. Let's try to think through this and do so critically. They're not then somehow trapping me in an identity. They're actually exposing me in the same way that they say, here, go and learn something about Chinese history, go and learn something about Canadian history or Mexican history. All of these things should enable us to see the fullness and complexity of human beings. And I think we lose that when we suddenly say, we're going to talk about individuals in some way. Yeah, I'm all about emancipating people from groups. We all know about terrible group situations where people are forced to think one thing or another. And this is one thing John has talked about earlier. I mean, the commitment to liberalism, such that you must have one, is to people being able to make choices for themselves. Freedom of conscience to me is more important than individuality.
Okay. Thank you, Rakim. And you know what? This is going to have to be our final question. I'm going to ask that you ask it quickly, John Benning, but go ahead and do so. And let's try and return a crisp answer to him. John, go ahead.
Yeah, totally. Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, so thanks so much for this. It was really great. So it seems like a convergence point between the two of your ideas on these topics is that history is definitely important in thinking about current day problems, but also that the ultimate utility of any particular historical lens is going to vary from like super useful to innocently nonsensical to actually a really bad way to think about this problem. So what's the best process for determining when it's useful and when it's not? And is anything in particular about the way we do this now or think about this now especially standing in the way of doing it the right way?
Coleman, we're going to go ahead and close on this with you. Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, so the process for doing it is no different than the process for figuring out what's true and reasonable on any topic. And part of that process is to foster and support a culture of skepticism and free speech and open dialogue, and to always discourage the worship of any particular writer or intellectual, to resist appeals to authority or to substitute an argument being logical for a particular person being lauded and prestigious, to oppose any taboos on reasonable criticisms, just to have a free and open sort of culture of critique and dialogue around issues where people aren't self-censoring, and hope that the best and most useful ideas come out of that kind of culture, which often but doesn't always happen, but certainly doesn't happen when people feel that their reputation is bound to having a particular opinion on the subject of historical racism.
Indeed.
John, can I offer one quick thing? This is I agree with Coleman entirely, but maybe just a practical piece. There was an expert on disinformation and misinformation. Long form reading is the way to deal with most of this. Short form reading often leads to misinterpretations of things and misperceptions. If you have the time, not every human being does, but this group has been here from 8 to 10 on Eastern Standard Time. Long form reading.
Indeed. I see Luke Phillips agrees with that. And so do I. Ladies and gentlemen, one more time, a round of applause, jazz hands in Zoom speak for Coleman Hughes and Rakim Brooks. And very quickly, Coleman and Rakim, let everybody here know where they can follow your work and how they can keep up with you. Anything you want to plug? Rakim Brooks, you first. Go ahead.
You can mostly watch my work at aclu.org/systemic-equality. I'm leading that initiative. Occasionally I'm writing pieces on the blog there, but that's where you'll see the substance of what we're working on.
I believe we have links in the chat, but Coleman, go ahead and let folks know where they can follow you.
You can listen to my podcast, Conversations with Coleman, available on all platforms. You can subscribe to get the ad-free version of my podcast at my website, colemanhughes.org. You can follow me on Twitter at coldxman. Any way, any of those is a way of supporting me that I would deeply appreciate.
Outstanding. And thank you both. This has been a wonderful conversation. And thanks to all of you for your fantastic questions and for everybody being willing to show up and join us tonight. Caroline, Alan, Bill, and Bonnie, and everybody whose questions didn't get through, we apologize. But stay with us. And if you are interested in the work, if you support the work of building out the communal spirit of American democracy, of being a part of our effort to cross the divides that mobilize our ability to reason and work together as American people, left and right, black and white, then I encourage you to join us. We are at braverangels.org. We're a membership organization. We may have a local alliance near you that you can be a part of. And if this is your first time doing anything with us, this event and events like this are just the tip of the iceberg of the experience and democracy that we are building at Braver Angels. And so once again, that is braverangels.org. Thank you for being with us tonight. We are building a house united. Until next time, thank you, folks.